assessment criteria and developing rubrics. I am Margot Eckenberg, and I am an academic associate at Teaching and Learning Services. And my role at Teaching and Learning Services is faculty facing. So I support instructors with teaching and learning, especially with all things related to assessment, and especially in terms of supporting instructors as we prepare for the new policy on assessment of student learning. And that policy is coming into effect within days. We've been working up to the beginning, and it is finally here. So I'm happy to have you with us today. I would like also for my colleague Rose to please introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rose Elekanachi. I am a fifth-year PhD student who just submitted a thesis, and I have been working in TLS for the past 4 years as a graduate student assistant, helping with a couple of activities at TLS. It's nice to meet everyone today.
Thanks so much, Rose. So Rose is going to be helping me with the chat, keeping track of everybody's comments, and also sharing links at the same time. So I did want to acknowledge that we're presenting today from McGill University in Montreal, and we're on unceded lands, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. I wanted to recognize their stewardship of this land that we are currently working on and acknowledge the importance of working towards a more just world that also incorporates the traditional stewards of this land in a more just fashion. So without further ado, we're going to begin now. And I'd like to do something to start us off. And I'm going to be asking you to use the chat. So if you could have that ready at hand. The new policy, I'm going to speak to the policy in just one moment, but something that it does ask us as instructors to do, what it expects instructors to do, is to share their expectations around assessment tasks or assignments with their students. So today I'm curious to know how you do that. How do you share your expectations with your students regarding the assignments for your course specifically? And if you could take a couple of minutes to put that in the chat, please.
We are now having some comments in the chat section. I see verbally before and now on my courses. Also tell them before each assessment, rubrics with clear criteria. That's actually a good one. That's all I have in chat for now. I'm sure a few people are also still typing.
Yeah, we'll wait just a few more minutes.
Show answer after assignments are handed in.
Okay.
Embedded in my courses documents, verbally too, in rubrics, etc.
Great. Well, I think please continue to add your chats. To add your comments at any time to the chat. We have some great ideas here already. We have verbally explaining to students what you expect, putting it in writing, and putting in writing in different ways. So perhaps listing it, including it in rubrics, having it on my courses. So when assignments are due, and then also there was a suggestion of looking at completed work by students and having a discussion about where they've met or perhaps have failed to meet those expectations. So that's great. In other words, many of you are already doing what is expected from according to the new policy, and I'll get into a little bit more of an explanation about why the new policy seeks to have students understanding more clearly what our expectations are and how assessment criteria specifically can help us get there. But it's important to know and for all of us to be aware of the fact that many of us are already doing these things and what I'm hoping to share with you today, what Rose and I are bringing today, are some tips on how to do this perhaps in a slightly different way, or to change the moment in the course in which you're informing your students of your expectations, and offering ideas about how to do this in a way that would really help student learning. So concretely, the goals for today's session are that by the end of today's hour-long session with us, we hope that you would be able to explain how assessment criteria and rubrics can support learning. We'll be coming to that in just one moment. You should be able to identify the components of a rubric. And finally, locate TLS resources for developing assessment criteria and rubrics that help support learning. So a big part of today's webinar is making sure that you know where to go if you're looking for help in developing a rubric or in designing and writing assessment criteria. So we have many resources at your that are available to you, and we want to make sure you know where to find them. So I'll be demonstrating some of that as well. So before we get into the where to find things and what can be useful for us, I did want to speak just very briefly to the Policy on Assessment of Student Learning, PASL, which is coming into effect. And I wanted to make reference to the name change. So up until now, McGill has had a assessment policy that was named the University Student Assessment Policy. And we've shifted now to the new policy on assessment of student learning. And so you'll notice that the shift has been a move from assessing students to assessing student learning. And today I'm going to be talking a fair amount about how assessment and learning are intricately related, and how we can really leverage our assessments to focus on learning and to help our students learn more. So I'm not going to get into many details about the policy itself. I wanted to make sure you knew where to go to find more information. So Rose can help me with sharing the link to the PASL website that gives a great deal of information on the background of the policy, on what's changing, on helping define the terms that you'll find in the policy. And there's a specific page with recommendations to instructors that we'll be looking at in one moment. But I wanted to also remind you that on the PASL website, there is a form with questions, a question form, and you can at any time, we will also, of course, be having a question, 2 question and answer periods during this webinar, but I did want to mention that I can take questions, we can take questions at TLS absolutely at any time. So once you've located that form, you might want to keep it bookmarked so that if you ever have a question about the policy, you can go ahead and send in your question. So I mentioned the notion of learning and assessment being intimately tied to learning. I want us to now think a little bit about what we mean by that. And what I'm sharing right now on the screen is a slide that I borrowed from the course design workshop that's offered at McGill by Teaching Learning Services. And what I wanted to do was show how integral learning is to all of the things that happen in terms of designing a course and then implementing a course at McGill. So I'm going to walk you through this slide, and then I'm going to be focusing on assessment criteria. But I felt it's necessary to give a little bit more context first to make sure we understand where assessment criteria fits into this larger picture. So you will have noticed the animation in the middle. It's learning as the very center, the very core, and it's related to everything that we do. It should be at the very center of your course. On the outside in the bottom left, you will see the context. So the context is your specific course context. Are you teaching online? Are you teaching in person? The department you're in, your discipline, and all of the things related to context. And then the 4 other blocks that we see are integral to designing a course. So up at the top, we have content, and we might ask ourselves the question of what's the content of the course? So often that's the place where instructors begin when you're designing a course or teaching for the first time. What's this about? What am I going to have to teach? If we move in a clockwise direction, the next moment would be outcomes. And this speaks to learning outcomes. So the question to ask here is, what will students be able to know, value, and be able to do in my course? So by the end of the course, what can they do? Just like I modeled a moment ago when I said by the end of this workshop, I hope that you would be able to meet these 3 outcomes. So those outcomes, those learning outcomes, will be the driving force of the entire course. I'm going to skip a moment across to the strategy, because the teaching strategies, which are also displayed here, talks about what's actually going to happen in the classroom. So what are the activities and the interaction? What's the engagement with students that's going to help support that learning? So what do you need to do in the classroom to make sure that they're learning not just the content, but they're achieving those learning outcomes of how they're going to use that content, or what they're expected to do with the content. And then the final piece I wanted to rest on is assessment. So assessment answers the question of, how are we going to know if students have learned or not the learning outcomes? Have they managed to get there, and how well? Right. So this is the scheme that I wanted to present in terms of how course design works at McGill, but also to help everyone think a little bit more about why our new policy on assessment of student learning does imply a kind of culture shift towards reaffirming why learning should be so integral to assessment. And some of the things that are being asked of us as instructors, therefore, is related directly to supporting the learning process in assessment. So I will be taking questions in a little bit. If anyone has questions at any time, you can please include them in the chat, and Rose will certainly help me with them later on. Here I'd like to show a little example then of what this might look like. And we've purposely chosen an example that is not academic, so we don't get into the weeds of anything to do with discipline. We're going to imagine for a moment that we're in a baking course, and the learning outcome that is being presented to students would be that by the end of this course, students should be able to create a professional, customized baked dessert. So that's the outcome. That's where we want students to be able to, where we want them to land at the end of the course. The teaching strategy would be a series of cooking labs where the instructor would actually be demonstrating to their students what, how to get there, right? What would be the steps that they need to follow. And take a moment, please, now to write in the chat which of the following 3 boxes at the bottom, the infographic, the oral presentation, or baking a cake, would be the best assessment strategy, do you think, in this case? You could just write 1, 2, or 3 in the chat. And if you have ideas about why, please include those as well.
So we've gotten about 3 responses now, all 3s. 3 response saying baking a cake. 3, number 3.
Right.
Yeah.
Lots of consensus. Wonderful. Does anyone want to write in the chat something about perhaps why they
3 has the
they
secret and answer and is in the pudding.
Very clever. Anyone else? Why would baking a cake be the best strategy in this case?
Hands-on task.
Right? Yeah. Definitely a hands-on task that would allow the instructor, right, to understand and determine whether the student has met the art learning outcome, right? So an infographic wouldn't allow the instructor to taste the dessert, for example. And we'll get into the details in just one moment. But thank you everyone for responding in the chat. You are absolutely correct. And it is, of course, a baking of the cake that would be the best assessment strategy. And here I wanted to point to something that in pedagogy is called alignment or constructive alignment, where the idea would be to begin with the learning outcome and then develop the assessment strategy, and only finally have a teaching strategy that would support both of the previous two. And so this is something that's called, as I say, that's called constructive alignment. And the idea is that we want instructors to begin to the degree possible, to also take a moment to think through their own assignments in their course and think of whether this kind of alignment is there. And if it's not, how we could perhaps work a little bit with the assessment tasks we've designed for our course and make sure that they're aligned this way with the learning outcomes and the teaching strategy. So the title of the webinar is writing tips for writing assessment criteria and developing rubrics. So before we go any further, I want to make sure we have a shared sense of what assessment criteria actually are. And I'm going to share the following definition with you. So assessment criteria are the assessment expectations. They describe the elements of learning, that is to say, the knowledge, skills, and values that are being assessed, and the standard the learner is expected to meet. So you'll remember that at the very beginning of the webinar, we asked you precisely to talk a little bit or to share with us what your expectations are and how you express them to your students. And assessment criteria is going to let you do that in a very targeted way. So what does this mean? It means that assessment criteria expresses your or shares your expectations with your students, but it also is divided up into these two parts, right? The elements of learning and the standard. So let's look at an example so that we can think a little bit through how what this might look like. And we're sticking with the cake example for now. So the examples of learning in the outcome of the students having to be able to produce a professionally customized baked dessert would be that we want them to learn how to prepare a cake that would be both tasty and moist. And we'd also want them to be sure that they could create a structure, they could engineer a structure that would produce a multi-tiered cake. Those would be the elements of learning in our example. And the standards would be, well, what is that cake going to be? What's the level they need to achieve to meet our expectations? So is it enough to bake a moist and tasty cake that they're going to sell at a bake sale? Or are they going to bake a moist and tasty cake that will be integrated into a wedding cake and has to be tiered, decorated, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so assessment criteria really try and address both of those elements. I want also to take a moment to show how this fits into alignment. So we looked at course design in terms of that large diagram of what are the different elements involved in course design and how learning is in the center. Then we looked at constructive alignment. And now I want to integrate assessment criteria into that same picture so we can see how it fits. So we have our same learning outcome, which is that students would be able to create the professional customized and baked dessert. The strategy would be the baking of the cake. The teaching strategy would be the labs on food, preparation, perhaps also lectures on food science and so forth. And the assessment criteria is going to be the specificity that will allow you to judge whether or not students have demonstrated the achievement of the learning outcome. So we know we've asked them to bake a cake, but we have to be able to assess that cake. And the assessment criteria is what is going to allow you to do that. But we're going to see it also helps give students a very clear target of what is going to be expected of them. This is the same idea, but I'm showing it to you in a different diagram now. Because I think by asking ourselves these questions, it can help us when we're developing our own or writing our own assessment criteria. So you'll remember learning outcomes are what do you want your students to be able to know or do or value. The teaching strategies are what are the best methods that will help students achieve those outcomes. The strategy is what's the task? What's the assessment task that would allow them to demonstrate that achievement? And then the assessment criteria allows you as an instructor to know how well those outcomes have been achieved. Have they achieved them and how well? And in a moment, I'll explain too that this can also be good for students because it gives them targets to work towards and can also help them with some self-assessment. If they know, they can check their work and see if in fact they are fulfilling the expectations and the requirements of an assessment strategy. This is that same diagram, but this time with the example of our cake fit into it to answer all of those questions, right? And here how we can see how engineering a stable multi-tiered structure would be the way in which we can determine that they have in fact achieved this learning outcome. We know they've baked the cake, but we have to make sure that the elements of the cake allow these outcomes to be fulfilled. So that's really what we're aiming for. I wanted to also speak just a moment to what assessment criteria, why it can be useful for students. And I think this is helpful too as we prepare for the new policy and assessment for student learning, precisely because this rationale is what's behind this particular change in the new policy, to be able to share ahead of time when an assessment task is given, and on the course outline at the outset of the semester, what the assessment criteria is going to be. And why does this help students? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it does provide students with a learning target. They know what they're working towards. It's also an equitable practice. So by ensuring that all students have a shared understanding of the instructor's expectations expressed through assessment criteria, it allows for a more level playing field. Everyone is starting with the same understanding of what's expected of them. It encourages self-assessment. I made reference to this just a moment ago too, and this is really important in terms of encouraging our students to submit high-quality work, right? If they're taking the time to measure their own work against what's established in the assessment criteria for them. Great. And another one is to focus on learning. So as you saw and as you've heard, the policies focus on learning, and really in general, the pedagogical impetus here is to make sure that assessment and learning are really closely tied. And getting students to focus on learning is always a challenge in a culture of grades, but it is important, and it helps them focus and remember why they're doing what they're doing at McGill. So I wanted to take a moment now after that explanation to show you some places to actually, if you wanted to work on developing your assessment criteria, we have several resources that can help you. And I'm going to navigate to the PASL website for a moment so that we can see two resources that I'd like to share there. So one is a short video. It's about 6 minutes, and it helps you develop assessment criteria specifically to integrate into a rubric. And there's also a written document that gives general recommendations for creating and writing specifically assessment criteria for your students. So here we are on the PASL website, and we're on the For Instructors page. And if you scroll down, there's lots of information here that we really hope will be helpful as you prepare for fall term, with suggestions and ideas on good practices in assessment that also help fulfill the expectations of the new policy. And we have a section on assessment criteria that you'll find here on the For Instructors page. And this is where you'll find the link both to the video and to the written document, the PDF document prepared by Royal Roads University about writing effective assessment criteria. So I wanted to highlight those. There are many other resources on this page, but since we're talking about assessment criteria, I wanted to make sure you had a sense of where to find those resources. There are a couple of other suggestions that we have for you today, and that's that at Teaching Learning Services, we're going to be holding an in-person on-campus workshop in September. And with this link, you can find the events page on TLS and register for that. So that's a 2-hour in-person workshop where we work hands-on with developing assessment criteria specifically. And then finally, at Teaching and Learning Services, there's always staff available if you wanted to have an individual consultation where you can work with your own material. So you can get feedback or have someone be a sounding board and listen to your ideas about your course outline, your rubric, your assessment criteria. So we encourage you to take advantage of the consultations that we offer at Teaching and Learning Service. Great. I think we're now going to, we're not going to see the video. We're going to pause the recording for a moment so that so in the second half of the webinar, we wanted to talk a little bit about developing a rubric. And in this portion of the webinar, I'm going to be talking a little bit less about theory and more about where to find help about developing a rubric. So in just a few minutes, it's difficult to sort of cover all of the bases, but we wanted to give you a sense of where to find help in developing your rubrics, and also offer a series of suggestions. So just before we do that, I did want to also highlight the ways in which rubrics can support students' learning. So again, the idea is that we don't want assessment criteria and rubrics to be sort of separated from the rest of a teaching and learning practice and an assessment practice. We really want learning to be at the very center. And so rubrics can be really useful for instructors. They can often help you save time when you're marking, but at the same time, they can also help students learning. And so I wanted to focus on some of those ideas. So I've been insisting from the beginning about this notion of sharing your expectations. Rubrics are a great way to do that. And we saw in the chat, some of you are already doing that. So that's wonderful. It can help students focus on the key criteria. So it helps the instructor when you're when you're designing a rubric and you're writing assessment criteria, it helps you identify for yourself what's really important in terms of your expectations. And then you communicate that clearly to the student so that they can see what you value most, for example, in terms of their learning. And so that can really help guide a student, particularly students who can sometimes be overwhelmed with the amount of information and so forth. So that's definitely a plus. Another, I referred to this too, using a rubric can make providing feedback more efficient. So this is positive both for instructors and for students. I mentioned just a moment ago this idea of saving some time by grading with a rubric, but it also can allow you to free up some time potentially to add written comments if you so desire in addition to the rubric, or using the rubric itself to really give more feedback to students that would then help them improve their learning. And so yet another way in which rubrics can support student learning. It also helps put students in charge of their own learning. So as I mentioned with assessment criteria, having a target to work towards can be very helpful, and a rubric can really work to help students, to guide them while they're preparing an assessment task of different kinds. Great. So just before I show you some resources, I'm wondering if we can either use the chat or you can use the reaction button in Zoom with a check mark. If we can get a sense of how many of you already use rubrics. So you can either raise your hand, use a check mark, put, say in the chat that you've used rubrics. They can be of your own design or given to you by course coordinators. It's more just of an interest of ours to know how many are using it.
We have about 3 or 4 people in the comments saying yes, they already use a rubric, now 5.
Great.
I don't see reactions yet because, okay, I don't see any reactions yet from anyone, but all the responses right now, I do in instruction and grade papers.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful.
Yeah, all yeses.
Great. Okay, so already quite a bit of familiarity with rubrics. That's wonderful. The suggestions that we're sharing today are really hopefully useful, both if you are thinking of revising a rubric or if you're thinking of creating one. So hopefully it will be useful to everyone. So I'm going to be showing a resource in just one moment that we have on the Teaching and Learning knowledge base. And just before I do that, I wanted to remark a little bit on why what I'm going to be showing you and why it can be useful to navigate to this page and what you can learn there. So the first one would be helping you determine whether an analytic or a holistic rubric suits your goals. And I'm going to show you what they look like and talk a little bit to the advantages of one or the other. It's not that there's one that's better than the other. It depends on the context of your course and the given assessment task, what you're looking for. So we're going to be looking at the difference between those two rubrics, and then also identifying the components of the rubric. So assessment criteria, which is an integral part of a rubric, performance standards, and descriptions of performance standards. And that'll be another tab. So let me go ahead and open this resource for you. Again, you will have these links so you can get quick access to the teaching and learning knowledge base. And we're here now. I'm going to skip the beginning of the introduction of the article because I've spoken to many of the points already. And I wanted to show you here where we have these tabs at the bottom, towards the bottom of the introduction page of the article about learning the basics about rubrics. So here's where you can find both the difference explained between analytic rubrics and holistic rubrics, and there's also an example so you can see what it looks like. So in an analytic rubric, it breaks the performance into multiple criteria, which are listed here in the left-hand column, the first column. And then, so the information, and what it does is it allows you to provide more detailed feedback to your students. It allows you to speak a little bit more to strengths and weaknesses. It can be very helpful if you want students to self-assess to make sure that they have a clear understanding of what the differences are between your expectations at the highest level and then what would need improvement and everything in between for each one of the criterion. This could be also very useful if there are multiple graders in a given course for a given assessment task to make sure that there's consistency among graders. A holistic rubric shares the same information, but it speaks to the student's learning as a whole. And so this allows for a global score based on the performance factors that are integrated into the description. So you would explain to students what the standard is, and then this would be the description both of the performance and of the assessment criteria written into this, into one paragraph. Okay, so that can be very helpful in terms of thinking about, so both of these share assessment criteria with their students. They do so in different ways. And again, the context, your specific context can help determine which would be best in your case. So I encourage you to take advantage of this resource to learn a little bit more about the types of rubrics. The other tab that I wanted to show you was this one about creating rubrics. And here it really, what the resource does is it outlines what the assessment criteria is, what the performance standards are, what the description of performance standards are, and it uses it gives recommendations about how to develop a rubric, and it also uses this code to be able to identify in the same example that we just saw previously, which are the different elements. So we know here in the analytic rubric, we have the assessment criteria in the left-hand column, we have the performance standards at the top, and the descriptions in each one of the first, in the first row alongside the assessment criteria. In a holistic rubric, as I mentioned earlier, you'll have the performance standard on the left, or clearly visible, it can be at the top as well, and the assessment criteria and the descriptions of performance are together, available together in the description. And here you can see we've also linked the video that I recommended a moment ago. This is also on this resource, so you can have things in one place. So those were the two elements that I wanted to show you. There's more about learning, more about how to use a rubric to promote learning and other recommended practices. So I really encourage you to explore this resource more fully. I wanted to also show you another resource, which we'll come to in another moment. So this is a little bit about what happens once you have a rubric. Once your rubric is done, all rubrics need tweaking and adjusting. So there's different ways of doing that. So soliciting feedback is a great way to get responses on where and how to think about revising your feedback. A great idea is to share it with a colleague. That can even be before you use it. Ask a colleague if you think that your rubric is clear, if it's understandable to students, if it seems to address your expectations. You can have a conversation about that. Another way to get feedback certainly is to ask your students after they've used the rubric. So was it helpful? Why or why not? Can it be tweaked? Have them give you concrete suggestions for revising your rubric. And as I mentioned before, you can also have a sounding board and a staff member at Teaching and Learning Services as a way to make adjustments. Another great way of thinking about revising or adjusting your rubric is to look at examples of other assessment tools. And here I'd like to show you a resource that we've prepared at Teaching and Learning Services that we hope can be useful. It's a bank of examples that have been used either at McGill or currently being used across disciplines, all different course levels as well. And this bank is currently in progress. We are soliciting rubrics or other kinds of grading tools. So if anyone would like to contribute to it, we would be more than happy to receive your rubric or your assessment tool. And I'm going to show you how it works. And just before I do that, I did want to mention that you can search it. So one of the great things about this resource is that the examples can be searched by assessment type. So say you want to design or you already have a rubric for an oral presentation and you want to see what other instructors at McGill use when they're assessing oral presentations in their classes. And so you can go ahead and search by assessment type. You can also search by learning outcome. So perhaps it's oral skills, that oral communication skills that you want to be assessing, and you can search that way to see what tools come up. You can also search by subject level or course level. And I'm going to navigate there now so that we can see what it looks like. So we're back in the teaching and learning knowledge base. This article is called Examples of Assessment Tools. And after a brief introduction, and here there's a recommendation, which I think is important if you do decide to adapt a rubric that someone else has used, someone else has designed, please consider acknowledging the author of the rubric. And in this at this moment here, at this link, this will, if you click on this, this will open up the table for you. And we'll give it a moment to load, and I will show you an example of what you can do and what it looks like. So first we see that in each one of the rows, there's going to be a link to the actual tool, the name of the instructor who shared the tool, a brief context summary, so you have some sense of how the tool works within the context of the course and what purpose it serves, the assessment type, the learning outcome, the subject, and finally the level of the course. And the search bars are all up here at the top. So this is where you can look by assessment type. This is not a comprehensive list. It's the kinds or the types of assessments that we've received thus far. So presumably this could grow as we receive more and more examples. So you can see we have class preparedness, creative project, debate, essay, group work, infographic, multimedia, oral presentation, participation, peer assessment, project, and et cetera, et cetera. So many options there. Here's where you can see the learning outcomes. So creativity, critical thinking, media literacy, problem solving, right? So this is searching by learning outcomes. And this is where you can search by subject and level. So another nice thing about this search tool is that you can also choose you can select more than one option at a time. So if you wanted to search by oral presentation, but also peer assessment, sorry, shift button. Did I get it wrong? No, it's the control button. It will then select those that are both that have both of those. And then you could also make multiple selections across. So you could say, okay, I want oral presentation peer assessment, but I also want to make sure that the learning outcome is perhaps research, and then it will filter again. We'll have fewer because that would be fewer options there. Rose, yes, please.
I just wanted to read a comment I have in the section in the comments, which I think is important. Could we have
Absolutely.
examples in French for that assessment tool? I looked them up and didn't find one.
This is a collection of tools that have been shared with us, examples that have been shared with us. Thus far, we haven't received any in French, but we would be more than happy to publish them as soon as we have them. So it's completely on a voluntary basis that the tools have been shared with us, but we'd be thrilled to receive tools both in English and in French. Absolutely. So I wanted to also just give you a sense, when you click on one of these, you can see what would actually come up for you is the actual assessment tool itself, right? So you can get a sense of the language used, the weighting or point system, what's the assessment criteria that this instructor worked with, and so forth. So examples really can be wonderful in terms of getting inspiration, in terms of being able to adjust your own rubrics, or maybe even develop them, right? There might be one here that could work very well for your context that you'd like to develop. Great. So I'd like to, before we take questions, I would like to encourage you to think a little bit. I'm also going to be sharing more resources. So perhaps before I think we're okay for time. So I think I'm going to ask you what your next step would be. So I've shared quite a bit of information with you. And I'd like to ask you to please write in the chat now what you think your next step will be. What do you think you're going to do with the information that you've learned today?
We do have two comments in the chat. Refining a rubric and getting feedback. Revise and add learning outcomes to my courses. Meeting with a colleague to revise our rubric. That's all I have indefinite.
Great. Those are amazing. There are more coming in, I think.
Yes. I would go back again. Exploring resource and thinking about translating that in clear and simple French, that is instructions that are easy to understand for the student. I'm always struggling with the points attached to a box with the holistic type. Do we have to culminate a total? This, I think, is a question.
Okay,
Do
we'll
we
hold
have
off on the question for the
later?
question period. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Rose.
Review, browse all links, start developing rubrics, and revise syllabus. Yeah, we do have one question in the chat room already.
Great. I think we're going to hold off on the question. If they're still coming in, that's fine. While the responses come in, I would like to share some resources. Then we'll stop the recording and I'll take all of the questions. But feel free to keep adding your next step. If you're writing, we will come back to them in one moment. I wanted to share a few more resources. You will be getting this PDF of this presentation, but it's important to speak just a little bit to what I'm sharing with you. So some TLS resources I wanted to send to you were the links where you could, in the teaching and learning knowledge base, where under the section of providing feedback, commenting, and grading, you will find both rubrics, the basics, and the examples tools. And there's also an excellent resource on giving feedback. So I encourage you to look at those. There's also another way of sharing assessment criteria that didn't fall within the scope of this webinar, but that might be useful to you, are suggestions on using exemplars. So this is using former student work with their permission to show current students what your expectations are by having them identify excellent work or perhaps work that is still progressing, and having them reflect on that previously done student work to help them with their own current learning in terms of fulfilling your expectations. If you're interested in course design, I mentioned that at the very beginning of the webinar, how at McGill we encourage you to design a course. We have several offerings available through Teaching Learning Services, in person, online, but also on demand, where you can do a self-access, self-paced course design course. And another really important resource that I wanted to share is that if you're interested in building a rubric directly on my courses, we have a link that will help you it's a short tutorial that will walk you through how to do the rubric on my courses, and then it'll be directly linked to your grading on my courses. So for some of you, that might be particularly interesting. And then finally, I just wanted to share a couple of PASL resources. We do have a course outline template that would help you adapt your own course outline to what you're being asked to do for PASL, and that's available also in the Teaching and Learning knowledge base, but you'll have the link here. We already navigated to the For Instructors page on the PASL website, but the What's Changing page might also be of your interest. And I had already mentioned asking questions there anytime. So thank you very much. Rose, we can cut the recording, and I'm going to get rid of the presentation.